Most every Republican, Mr. President, in this body and probably outside of this body, would admit that President Obama inherited a very bad economic situation by the time he was sworn in. The only thing is, by every measure of the economy, this economy is much, much worse now than what he inherited. The Obama economy is bad because there's a prospect of taking more money from the American taxpayers with the biggest tax increase in the history of the country next year. Many, many brand new regulations that are very costly to the economy. So particularly small business don't know where they're going to be hit next and where their costs are. We have this big budget deficit that's a damper on the economy. And in every respect, things that this administration's doing is putting a wet blanket on the economy. We have wrong-headed energy policies as well. So we hear the president say, when he put forth his jobs bill, touring the country in his bus, he kept saying, pass this bill right now, pass this bill right now. We've had some experience with efforts to pass bills right now, and they got passed, like the stimulus bill 1 month after he's sworn in. Supposed to keep unemployment under 8%, but it's never been under 8% since 1 month after that time. We have to pass the health care reform bill right now. And the health care reform bill was passed that very first year when the other party controlled everything, all three political branches of government. They had everything their way, and it was passed right now. And we're finding out that passing something right now just isn't the way to do business. And particularly if it's done in a partisan way. I think the extent to which President would lead instead of being on the fringe would help this process along, because he's the only elected official in this country that speaks for the national voice. Each one of us representing our constituencies have a national perspective, but we also have to be worried about the needs of our constituents. So let's go to what the latest effort is of this president to turn this economy around his way and get this bill passed right now. Just a few weeks ago, the Senate considered a so-called jobs bill that would have provided $35 billion of the $447 billion for the purpose of creating or saving jobs for teachers and policemen, firefighters. This state bailout was included by President Obama in this 447 stimulus bill number 2 that he proposed in his speech before Congress this September. When it became apparent that the Senate leadership didn't have the necessary votes for the whole package, then Majority Leader Reid chose to move this bill in parts instead of in one big package. And you know, most of the reason he had to do that is because people in his caucus were not ready to vote for big tax increases or taking more money away from the American people and sending it to Washington. Proponents for that bill argued that this $35 billion bailout was necessary to prevent the layoff of teachers and public safety employees. And don't forget, this isn't the first time the Senate had considered this type of bailout, because it was that bailout that just had to pass right now in February 2009 that was supposed to keep employment under 8%. That was the $1,814 billion stimulus bill that Congress enacted in early 2009. And as I said, it included bailout money for state and local governments. In fact, that's one of the reasons it didn't work, because whether you're state, local, or federal government, governments consume wealth. They don't create wealth. And when you put half of that bill of $814 billion into public employment, it doesn't create jobs. That money should have been used to stimulate private sector employment. President Obama stated that that bill would save or create up to 4 million jobs over the following 2 years. That bill was supposed to create or save 150,000 jobs for teachers, nurses, firefighters, police officers, according to our president. Then in August 2010, Congress passed another state and local bailout, this time sending $26 billion to states to save or create public sector jobs. At that time, Robert Gibbs, the White House spokesman, stated that this bill was, quote, a very important proposal, particularly to ensure that 160,000 plus teachers didn't get fired as a result of bad state budgets. This $26 billion was the second major effort by Congress to help states plug their budget holes, while claiming that we were saving the jobs of teachers and other government workers. The truth is, these efforts to save state and local public sector jobs are more simply a bailout of state and local governments that have failed to rein in their own spending. State and local governments become addicted to tax and spend big government policies, and federal bailouts have only aided the addiction. Rather than making the necessary and difficult budget decisions, these state and local governments come to rely upon the spendthrift behavior of this Congress to spend more and plug budget holes. Nationally, the debt held by states is approaching $3 trillion, and that doesn't even figure in unfunded pension liabilities. Some of the states in the worst trouble are Massachusetts, Rhode Island, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, Illinois, and California. The increase in debt has had a significant impact on their budget or on their bond rates and abilities to find competitive bond rates and competitive financing. The free spending state legislature, coupled with the huge public workforce, have driven up the cost of doing business in these states. It has also negatively impacted their unemployment rates and their economic growth. For much of the history of our country, states have been responsible for financing their schools, police, firefighters, first responders, and other public employment. Now, we know throughout the 224-year history of our country, most of the time, the state and local governments has done a pretty darn good job. States have done well, states that have done well have grown economically and attracted more jobs, and with economic growth, you're going to have more taxpayers. And what this country needs is more taxpayers, not more taxes. States that haven't managed their budgets well have had, as you might expect, the opposite result. This competition among states has created a system that demands and rewards good government, and in the process attracting employers and workers. A federal bailout of states upsets this balance. It rewards bad behavior and ultimately hurts the American economy. Federal bailouts eliminates the risk associated with poor economic policies. Moral hazard, as federal bailouts send a message to bad actors that there's no negative consequences for their failure to effectively govern. At the same time, this type of federal stimulus is ineffective at saving or creating jobs. and it does nothing to promote private sector growth. Annual federal deficits are close to about 8 to 9% of GDP, and our national debt is $15 trillion. We cannot afford to bail out states and continue to encourage poor fiscal behavior by our states. The bailout of Democratic governors and state legislatures, and I suppose I ought to include Republican governors and Republican state legislatures as well, and public employees may be good politics, but it's terrible economics and creates even worse fiscal situation. Rather than propose political solutions during this economic downturn, the President should work with Congress to find real, authentic, genuine solutions to our economic and unemployment problems. The recession began in December 2007. Nearly 1 in 10 Americans remain unemployed today. More than 26 million Americans are either unemployed or underemployed. The policies of the past 2.5 years have not worked. They've made things worse. Now, for the benefit of people who maybe you can't say this too often because it looks like it's strictly partisan, I think we all ought to admit that this president inherited a bad economic situation. Nothing to be proud of for a Republican president going office, or any of us Republicans that were in office at that time. But by any measure of the economy, this president has made things worse. The time for political documents has long passed. It's time to govern, to work together, to get our economy growing again, and move the Obama economy into a bipartisan economy that leads to job creation. For those who are unemployed, it's a depression. It's time that we did something to help turn this situation around. Private sector employers need an international trade agenda that opens new doors to sell U.S. agricultural goods and manufactured products and services. So obviously, I'm glad that the President finally sent to the Senate 3 trade agreements and that they were passed last month. They were delayed, though, unnecessarily for years, and the rest of the world is moving ahead without us. We're more than capable of increasing exports, but we need the markets to do it. And it's very simple. Why worry about exports? Because only 4% of the people on the face of this earth live in the United States. The other 96% live outside the United States. Who are you going to market to? The 4%? Yes, but you're also, if you're going to expand your economy, you're going to have to market to the other 96%. Now, thank God, President Obama has set an agenda that he wants to double exports. But in order to reach this goal and to do everything possible to generate economic activity and opportunities in the United States, the President needs to move forward on other job-generating trade initiatives without delay. It's time to put an end to job-killing federal regulations as I move on to a new subject of why the economy is not so good. New regulations from EPA, the Department of Labor, National Labor Relations Board, and others are making it harder for business to grow. Now understand, I said new regulations, because I think sometimes people, when they hear us talking about a moratorium on regulations, they think that we ought to take all the regulations that are on the books off. They're kind of, they may not necessarily be good, but they're kind of, the economy has accounted for them already. But when you got 9.1% unemployment, you got all these new regulations coming out. You know, 66,000 pages of new regulations just so far this year. It just makes it very hard to decide whether or not you ought to hire somebody or not. And particularly for small business. And remember, small business creates 70% of the new jobs and about 25% of all unemployment in America. In some cases, new regulations are actually destroying jobs. With unemployment at 9 1/10%, it's time for the federal bureaucracy to stop harmful job-killing new regulations. What we're really calling for is not to stop ever regulating into the future, but just put a short-term moratorium on regulations so people have a chance to get us out of this hole we're in. 9 1% unemployment. Let's say a measure of getting unemployment down to 7% before we have new regulations. It's also time to develop domestic energy resources that will create jobs while increasing domestic energy supply. Nobody seemed to be very concerned about spending $830 million every day. Now, just in case that sounds phenomenal, $830 million a day is the amount of money that we pay to send overseas to bring oil into this country. That's a terrible subsidy to the volatile Middle East that want to train Americans to kill us. Or it's a reward for Chavez, that is Hugo Chavez, that's bad-mouthing us almost every day. We need to make more energy available, driving down prices, making our country more energy independent. The president's energy agenda is moving us backwards because of not enough emphasis upon fossil fuels that are available right here in this country. You know, it wasn't only 3 years ago that natural gas was $14, $15 because we thought we were using it all up in America. And discoveries recently tell us that we got natural gas maybe for 100 years. Now it's down to around, I think, $4 to $5 now per unit. But it's it's not a case of finding fault with the president on green energy, because whatever source of energy you have, if you want a growing economy, you're obviously going to use more energy. Now, use more energy conservatively, so we ought to have an energy policy that encourages conservation, but it ought to encourage use of our fossil fuels wherever it can be found. It ought to encourage all sorts of green energy, and that's all the biofuels that we in the Midwest talk about. It's all the wind energy that my state is second in production of. It's solar energy, biomass, cellulosic biofuels, all of the above. And I said conservation. I guess the fourth one would be nuclear energy. So it's time to change course and develop energy sources here at home and create jobs in the process. Finally, in 2009, President Obama said that you don't raise taxes in a recession. He stated his position clearly that the last thing you'd want to do is raise taxes on anyone during a recession because it would harm businesses and economic growth. And you know, when he said that, unemployment was under 8%. And so if you got 9 1/10% unemployment for now and quite a bit into the future, aren't we still in a recession? So isn't the president's own benchmark the benchmark that we ought to be using yet today? And yet we have the biggest tax increase in the history of the country, taking more money away from the taxpayers and sending it to Washington coming up next year. And boy, wouldn't it do a great deal of economic good if this president said exactly what he said about the time he was sworn in, that you shouldn't increase taxes during a recession. Yet we have so many job packages put before the Senate that include job-killing tax hikes. That's why they've been received with bipartisan opposition. So anybody that says the taxes that the president proposed have been killed by Republicans, one of the reasons the majority leader had to change the president's tax packages for a vote here a couple weeks ago is because there's opposition within his own conference about it. A few courageous Senate Democrats then have consistently said no to their leadership when it comes to raising taxes on small business and other job creators. The only bipartisanship we've seen so far is the bipartisan opposition to ill-conceived political documents. The Democratic majority needs to get serious about addressing our economic problems. It's time to consider policies that will get people back to work without harming the economy. It's time to stop the political aspects of this debate. And the best way to do that, it seems to me, is the other body, controlled by Republicans, have passed 15 pieces of legislation that will help turn this economy around. And I don't think we've taken any of them up, although I think we're about ready to take up, thank God, one of the 15, that 3% deal that we have, that's what it's known by. So unemployed Americans need to know that we're going to do something to help create jobs and grow the economy. And taking up more of those 15 jobs would be getting something done in a bipartisan way. Unfortunately, so far, the Democrat majority, President Obama, are more interested in political strategies that create jobs and economic growth. And the only reason I say this is it seems to me that there's a little bit of intellectual dishonesty between, on the part of a president that one day would have, one evening, would give a speech to a joint session of Congress, like he did in September, and plead for bipartisan support, and then the next day go out on the road on a political venture and say that can't get the cooperation of Republicans. Pass that bill right now, you know. I yield the floor.